Everyone. You are in our weekly live stream, and today I have the honor to host Peter Macdonald and Sebastian Doll. Both are software development and are developers and architects that were busy around permissions and authorization. I think in a specific field of permissions for developers. We are going to talk a lot about it today, so I'll not uncover what we are going to talk with them. But before we are starting, just some announcement. As usual, this live stream is sponsored by Permit.io, the company that I work for. This authorization for developers product, not for developers permission, for your customers permission, but with developers in mind as a first-class citizen based on open source. Another announcement is that everything is recorded today. If you just need to drop off, feel free to drop off because you'll get the live after, you'll get the video after an email. And we also see any comment that you leave, no matter if you're watching on YouTube, on LinkedIn, Twitter, any comment you want, any question you want to ask, we see that and we try to answer that live, but we'll also have time for Q&A at the end of the hour. So with that, I would like to start. So as I said, I'm Gabriel. I'm leading the developer relations in Permit.io, and with me, Peter and Sebastian. Peter, do you want to give a few words about yourself?
Quick introduction. So my name is Peter Macdonald. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I work for VodafoneZiggo, which is a telecoms company in the Netherlands. Primarily building a internal developer platform based on the Backstage framework from Spotify.
Yeah. And I actually saw Peter's name first time when he delivered a talk with Andres, who is also a good friend from Styra, on the last KubeCon about OPA for Backstage. And we are going to talk about it soon. But before that, Sebastian, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, nice. So my name is Sebastian Doll. I'm a solution architect and a developer at Size, which is a 125-year-old company. And we specifically do all around like vision solutions, medical products. And you probably have in your hands a product that we help to build, which is via our S&T and ASML products that basically provide the basic technology for high EUV technology to manufacture all of the chips in your phone. So you probably have something in your hand that is created by Size.
Yeah, that's I told Sebastian before, I saw Size booth in a We Are Developer conference, and they are super cool. Go find out what they do. And with that, met you both via your open source project, and I'll be happy to hear about them. So, Peter, what is your OPA for Backstage project do?
So the OPA permissions wrapper for Backstage is essentially a wrapper around the Backstage permissions framework, which allows you to use OPA to kind of delegate your permissions to, and it decouples it from the application. The reason we did that, or the reason that I wanted to do that is, number one, I'm an OPA fanboy, I think, at my heart. And the second one is that the permissions framework in Backstage, how it is now, it's great, but you have to recompile the code every time you want to change a permission, and it's really tightly coupled to the actual application. So we wanted a way to really like decouple that and put the power of the policy writing in the hands of people that should do it, and it shouldn't be on us. We're a very small team, so anytime anyone wanted permissions to something, we'd have to we merge request and we have to do a release and then all this kind of stuff. And now it's just as simple as updating the policy outside of the repository. So that was the main idea behind it.
So it's actually let developers control the delivery flow, the CI/CD, and everything they do with code delivery using policy as code with the Regal language of OPA, and using Backstage or like the orchestration engine to do the policy. We'll get to that soon because I think the developer portal is a great way to create security orchestrations about developers. Yeah. But beforehand, Sebastian, Peter said that he's an OPA fanboy. I know that you are OpenFGA fanboy.
I don't know if I'm a fanboy yet, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'll be happy to hear about your open source projects with OpenFGA. I think there are a couple, right?
Yes. So the thing is, we started a lot of new open source project, and actually we raised the question: do we want to implement an authorization in all of these projects, which means like having a role, defining roles, defining users, and do this in all of the projects, or actually want to what we do a modern approach and defer this? And then there was the question like, what is the system that you want to use in order to model your authorization separate from the application without the developer actually forcing to implement an API gateway or something that authorizes these requests? And then there was my decision taken to use OpenFGA or like a Zanzibar-like system, where you can model your or explicitly declaratively model your authorization system. Yeah, and then this ended up with building a lot of tooling around it in a sense. So, for example, we're using Open API to generate our APIs. And there is not a nice way to actually introduce FGA or OpenFGA into this. So there was a small tool to actually dynamically, based on the endpoints that we use, generate the request necessary for OpenFGA. So what is the user, what is the object, what is the relation, and then forward this. And yeah, and also tooling for provision this to Terraform, so do it consistently. Also provision the relationships into OpenFGA. Yeah, and that was the vector solving the problem of our authorization for our open source projects.
So you like the authorization for the users of the open source or for the developers that do the open source?
Both, in a sense, like first for the users of course, but also for the developers, because again, if you want to model, if you have one project like Backstage, it's okay because it will be a central system.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a small system, like for example, we have an open source project like Nox, where we have a Terraform backend, which is consistent and so on and so forth. And then we have this service lens you saw. And then we have many tools which use similar authorization systems, and we don't want to implement it every time. So we provide in a declarative way the system that we use, so you can provision it to your own authorization system. And then via OpenID tokens, you can then infer what is the identity and what is the authorization for the system. So we try to combine these two things. Yes.
Yeah, I think that interesting approach, because what you say is like if I'm thinking about from the platform thinking, you say every time you are open a new project, you have the baseline for authorization that you actually need. And that based is so that you have the Terraform provider for OpenFGA and some projects around it that actually baseline and streamline the permission for using OpenFGA. I must say that Permit also has this open source project called OPAL, Open Policy Administration Layer, and this is an enabler to do authorization with OPA. It knows to deploy OPA and to synchronize data. And when I look to OpenFGA, I also thought that they are great policy engines, but they are hard to deploy. They are hard to baseline. They are hard. So I think your both projects say, okay, I want to use that. I know this is a great engine, but I need to find a better way to do that. I think the question that these both projects is led to me: what is changed? What is changed in software development that we do not just have this FTP server with one permission that you can deploy your artifact, and we need actually fine-grained authorization for developers? But what do you think changed, Sebastian, in terms of the software development lifecycle?
I think there are a lot of things changed. For us, I think you have a growing organization, and it's not sufficient anymore to associate authorization to roles. That's insufficient, because at least I have 1,000 roles, I would guess, right? Via certain graphs in our organization. So to switch the problem and actually say, what is required of me via all my factors that I have to be authorized, for example, in one API point to do one operation. So shifting the problem actually on the developers, say, what is the factors that I have to bring in, not have a central team managing, oh, I have to create a new role, then I have to put this into a, for example, GWT token, and then we have to put this GWT token into a middleware, and then this maps to the roles actually in the system that you maintain. No, from my point of view, it's switching this to the developer to take them in control and say, what is actually the factors that we need from this large organization, from the people, in order to authorize them for one particular endpoint. And also it gives you a really fine-grained, and that's why it's in the word, a fine-grained access to specific surfaces in the application. That also makes it more secure. I think security has been a primary factor now, because we have so many APIs, so many systems, and it's hard to control via just roles. So that's why I'm assuming that this is the vector that we see in organizations.
I think that this perspective of, you say, in one hand there is role explosion, and to solve that we need to prepare or to bring more factors into authorization, like fine-grained authorization. So you also bring the factors, the relationship and the resources themselves. So that's a great point, and that's a user-centric approach. You said the user did not enough with the authorization. Peter, do you think that more things happen that led to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think not only that with the relationship, but you can also, now we look at things like attributes as well, right? Like when you think of things like, yeah, exactly. It's always going to be open related, but but things like like a bank teller can, maybe depending on how many years of experience that they're in the company, if they're 5 years, they can do up to a certain amount, or 10 years, they can do up more or less. Yeah, and to just build on what Sebastian said, I think also you have this now sprawl, right? Where like developers also have more hands on more tools all over the place, and so you have all these new permissions and all these different tools. So I think it's not as simple as it was maybe before, where you just have the FTP server, like you said, and just have I'm a developer, so I just get access to kind of everything developer related type thing. So
yeah, I think the thing I like with this answer is that you say there are much more components, there are much more systems that we need to streamline the developer's permission across it. If I'm now designing my permission system, what do you think are the components that we need to streamline the permissions on?
I would also add one thing that I just want to build on the other.
Yeah,
it's also the way, and that's for us important. And I think that's why it will become more relevant in enterprises. We have a ton of legacy systems. So for us, it's sometimes not the question to actually build new systems, which we do, right? We do new things. But the ton of the things that we have is like years old, custom made. And then there comes the question, how do we secure this? Because security becomes first prime. And then you have to have a system which you can flexibly try to implement over time. And role-based is not giving you this fine-grained access pattern. So I think that's really important also for the implementation part. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's interesting point. Actually, in 2 weeks from now, I'm also in October 9th, I'm going to have a live stream with Nick Tune. He wrote a book about architecture modernization. He's a strong figure in the DDD community, in the domain-driven design community. And we have a long discussion back then that led to me to ask him to join the live stream about how do we incorporate modern security into systems? Is that a new business domain? Which is that's a good question, right? Security is a business domain now, maybe, and maybe we need, to take care for that as a specific business domain and invest in that. And I think fine-grained authorization is a great enabler for that. If we are saying that we are externalizing authorization, and we are decoupling between the policy schema and the policy data, and we are ensuring that is external to the system, then it's easier to add the enforcement layer in the legacy system without them support with new roles and etc. I think it's good, and I really want to back to Peter's answer and again ask the question of what is, Peter, the components that you think if I'm come now to design permissions for developers, What do you think the components that we need to streamline permissions across?
Components as in like the tools that we need to streamline.
Yeah,
across?
like let's say CI/CD. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just from what I do, I have access to things like all the CI/CD tooling, or Argo CD deployments, all that kind of stuff. And I think that we should have, or it would, the ideal scenario is you have like this centralized policy, right? Or even things like just in time or JIT type permissions, so that I can only do things at certain times. But one of the things, and maybe I don't know if we'll get to this in a bit, but otherwise I'll just say it now. So when we were looking at Backstage, one of the cool features that we liked was the software templates. And these software templates let you kind of deploy this repository, and you can build all of these rules in straight away. So you have that, like that's a way of streamlining, in my opinion, where a developer doesn't even really need to think about, or nobody needs to think about, like, what kind of permissions should we put on this? You just do it once, and it should apply all the time to every new repo you make, right? In an ideal world, that would be the best way. You have the guardrails straight away, and you don't need to worry about it later on.
Sebastian, are you using developers portals like Backstage and stuff like that?
We have Backstage.
Really nice. Yeah, we should chat.
Yeah, we should also write a plugin for OpenFPA for Backstage. Then we'll have a fully covered. Yeah. But I think the developer portals is a great way to to orchestrate, as Peter mentioned, to create baseline. Do you also find developer portals to be helpful for such mission?
For sure. I think from point of view, yes. I mean, developer portals in itself, yes. I think that's one pattern, but also in general, you can do this also with prepared pipelines or prepared, even GitHub templates, for example, to put in an ACL or to put in the case of OpenFPA, for example, the declarative representation of your model, put it in there, and that via pipeline deploy this via Terraform into your installation. I think, yeah, that's the way for developer productivity. And I think all of these systems make it possible. And I think that's the interesting part. They mostly today are declarative, which is also a change in how we do developer, or how we achieve developer productivity, and why we can scale this out. I think that was not sophisticated. I mean, like, let's go for Entra ID, right? Which is something that you use like from Azure AD to Entra ID for roles. It was not designed in a way to do these kind of things. But these systems that we have now with OpenFPA, Open Policy Agent, all of this, basically you can use them declarative, or they are declarative systems. And I think that's the main factor to bring this and make the developers productive. That's a significant change. Yes.
Yeah. And Peter, I know that you developed an OPA plugin for Backstage. Do you think that developer portal should put permissions as their core? Like, should offer it as a feature without people need to develop plugins?
Well, a cool story on this, I think, actually, is that Backstage originally didn't have any form of permissions at all. I don't know if internally at Spotify they don't. I don't know. They must use it outside or something. Maybe they have something.
Try to play with my Spotify.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but yeah. So they actually built something on request of kind of the community. It was kind of like, yeah, we need some kind of permissions here, and I think for them it was like, but why? Everything should be visible. Everybody should be able to do everything, and not every company is so mature, right? That you can just, hey, can you just go spin up a cluster for us? Yeah, no worries, I'll go do that. But all of a sudden you have a 700,000 AWS bill somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, they built this permission framework, but as I said, the problem is that it does work, and it's great, but it's got its limitations. And I think that even some other people built some other permission type plugins as well that are based off of I can't remember what it's called, but I think Red Hat also have their own permissions type plugin, and Spotify then released a commercial version of an RBAC plugin as well. So I think it should be there, and I think it should be built in from the core, but obviously, yeah, maybe not as everyone wants it.
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting because you mentioned Spotify say, I don't care that everything is visible. But the thing about fine-grained permissions for developer and the thing about actually developer portal is not what about visible, is
Yeah.
what they are able to initiate, what they are able to create. And I think if we are looking on what changed is that developers are not anymore write code and then there is this ClickOps that pushing it to the cloud. You write one line of code, and by mistake, you can, as you said, spin up an instance that will cost 700,000 bucks in a month after. So I think that that's a great point to put that if you want to build a developer portal and you understand that developers need portal because they do much more with just delivering one line of code, then you should put permissions as your main focus. And that make me curious because I know GitHub itself, for example, GitHub as a code collaboration platform, but also GitLab, any kind of collaboration platform, has a nice FGA infrastructure by themselves. If you look at the GitHub permission, sometimes, to be honest, is even too complex. Even myself, that I understand permission and now know permissions, sometimes find myself struggle with the way to define permissions in OpenMP in GitHub, especially for open source project that you want to let people see, you want to let people maybe even push, but you don't want them. So do you think people should utilize these permissions and on top of that put tools like developer portals and OPA? Or do you think they should say, okay, GitHub is like a service account and I'll do the permissions myself?
That's a good question from point of view. Um, the question is how much complexity you want to manage. It's
Mhm.
or how mature. I think it's a maturity thing. I think it's not bad to start actually with putting everything on GitHub and trust that what you do there in configuration, and you can partly do this via Terraform, for example, actually in code. There's also vectors to do this in code. Um, but yeah, as more as you mature, your systems become more complex, and then you have the developer productivity problem. You have this system with different authorization. Then you have to map everything to GitHub, which can become really complex actually.
Yeah, I think when I actually so the Backstage open plugins that I have are kind of like the first open source project that I actually did myself, and setting up the repository app, because I've used GitLab a lot more than I've used GitHub, and I did actually find it kind of difficult to figure out, like you said, the rules, like who can push, who can do this, who can do that. So I think maybe it would be nice even if they had. Like it's just at the top of my head, some kind of like even like a template or something you could apply. This repository is an open source one. It says, hey, maybe you want to do this and this, 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 this. But I think it can't hurt, right, to have additional. It can never hurt really to have a few additional things on top, maybe just in case, just to cover yourself or something like that.
And it's an enterprise feature. You get a lot of these
Yeah, of
kind of
course.
feature and
Yeah,
policy
yeah.
things
Yeah.
via the enterprise offer. So
But actually,
that's the pity, right?
Yeah.
yeah, actually, what Sebastian mentioned is something very similar to that. 2 years ago, there was a tweet in one morning. I woke up in the morning and then I saw a tweet that 35,000 GitHub repositories been hacked, and that a couple of hours later they defined that nothing was hacked, and the thing there was a phishing campaign of some group of Russian hackers. That what they did, they clone famous repositories like Kubernetes and stuff like that, and they did commit spoofing. Commit spoofing because in Git everything is a file. What you can do is actually change the committer name, and since GitHub is a cloud environment, you can put your, I don't know, Kelsey Hightower email on your commit message, and then it looks like the last commit is Kelsey Hightower, and this Kubernetes just have an extra E in the Kubernetes, and you think, oh, that's Kubernetes, I'll clone the code, and then this vulnerability. And one of the practices that I shared back then to solve that is manage your GitHub there is a GitHub Terraform provider. And when you have this, when you are managing your GitHub account, and it's something that we actually do here in Permit, when you are managing your GitHub account, you have this baseline because you can enforce policies that say a new repository is created only if it stands in that security rules. right? And you can even, for example, use OPA or other static analysis like engine analysis like Chekhov and Keeks on top of this Terraform file and create your internal repository. So you can make sure that no developers can create a repository unless they are pushing. And I think that architecture that led me to an interesting question. Something that we experience a lot in permits. So we are developing a platform that let developers implement authorization in their product. But we also need to give them the right permissions. We don't want developers to change critical policies. And then we need to give that permission. And so we create like infinity loop of policy for policy for policy for policy for policy. What do you think is the head or the root of this tree of policies? How do you think we can draw a start point where we say, okay, this is our, I don't know, something that we can ensure, and from that we are starting to implement permissions on developers? I hope this is a clear question.
Yeah, that's a really tough question, I think.
Yeah.
I would think that in the root policy, I think as long as you had the core business logic in there already, and then you can reference the other policies in it. But that's probably something that you're already similarly doing, I guess, something like that. But yeah, I'm not actually sure how you. Yeah, I've not had that problem yet. Thankfully, we haven't had this the problem where we reference multiple policies. But yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah. Sebastian, do you have any thought on that?
I was just thinking about if you have the same problem in itself like with Zanzibar, because I mean then you don't think about root but relationship, you know, and then you define it. So I mean this particular, but the thing that I'm always thinking about is like with this root thing, you have this also with GitHub. The thing is, the root permission is always like one entity, like the repository, or it's the user. Just plainly speaking, it's something in the URL. And that's like your key where you actually attach something to it, like a policy. And from there, you infer everything that is below this. So then you build a structure. And I think that's actually a tough problem. I also observed this, like what is like the actually what you called root? What is actually the unit that actually defines all of the subsequent permissions? And for example, you find this always in the URL from my point of view, like in a RESTful API, it's like you start usually, for example, with Google, it has teams or projects. That's their unit of measure, and then they attach everything permissions to this. In AWS, it's different. It's, for example, it's the account because they have a different model, and the same is with GitHub and all other things. So what is the first thing in your URL where you attach it? Is it team-based? Is it role-based? Is it project-based? And from that, you define it. And that's creating a ton of problems for all of the relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, I was muted. I think the answer is interesting again because you're bringing the user perspective, and this user-centric permissions is actually an interesting point because at many authorization system and in many policy system, the main entity is not the user. The main entity is maybe the data. The main entity is maybe the structure. For example, I know we just chat about it, but I think it's important to mention. So last week there was a new vulnerability exposed in the Arc browser. So probably many developers knows Arc browser. It's very popular, and they actually using Firebase as their backend, and they allow you to create website boost, a piece of like JavaScript code that you can run on website to do some modification. I don't know if you are entering a website and you want them in dark mode, you can write a custom code that make it dark mode and then you can run it. And they apparently store this JavaScript code in Firestore, which is the Firebase database, and they haven't protect the creator ID field. So you can change the creator ID as any user, and that means if I know your user ID, I can put your user ID and then I can run JavaScript code in your browser. And that's a great example of, authorization failure, because if you're just, even with Firebase row level security, you can protect that. You can assert creator ID with the user ID, and then you can avoid the change of that. But the problem with such row level security is that you have the user flow and the user journey in mind. And sometimes, as you mentioned, you want another user to be able to change the creator ID or the assigner with permissions, not for everyone. But then the row level security is not enough. It's not enough for your use case, and then you are changing that. So you leave the row level security, but you not find an alternative for that. And I think that's a great approach for people who want to do fine-grained authorization, who want actually to do fine-grained authorization, even for developers, to put the developers in mind. To put the developers, okay, I want to check what the developer can do, what I want to let the developer do. And by understanding and knowing what the developer want to do, then I can model policies and I can model for fine-grained. And that can maybe even help me with planning the reverse point of that, to understand where this policy stop. Where do I have service account that can do everything? And from them, I'm checking what users can do. And from then I'm porting maybe service account, maybe users, but then I get very fast to the level where are the end users are doing stuff. I think that's a good solution for that tough question. And I think with that, you're both like work around cloud native security. Both OpenFGA and OPA are CNCF backed project, and they are very popular. Do you think that cloud native architecture is a part of this permission challenge? What do you think?
So I can give you one aspect to that. Large enterprises, they are cloud natives today, but they are not like uniquely cloud native. I would put it this way: we have many vendors, right, that we work with. Even in the cloud, we have still on-premise. We have a footprint around the globe. So we use different providers necessarily around the globe. So cloud native is a problem because you have to have a shared control plane across these different environments, or it should be possible. And that, of course, brings with it the challenge: how do you bring this about? And then you get to cloud native technologies, because that's the only thing that you have available that provides this, like Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes, OpenPA, OpenFGA. So that's a vector that I think about a lot, is cloud native, in the sense that we stretch different environments, and that's also meaning stretching different environments with the same authorization patterns and also authentication patterns. Yes.
Yeah, I think the way that cloud natives help modern enterprise, like you mean SaaS and enterprise like that, streamline and unify the provider. That's something that actually enabler for them, but also required to create more stakeholders around this permissions game. And yeah, I think one of the question that came to my mind when I'm talking about like a cloud native. So back then, when we are speak about again this FTP server that we've been upload stuff, there wasn't a concept of service account. We have one server, and this server has one certificate that you can log into, certificate that was shared. So some that creates some level of service on top of that. And today we have a mesh of service account. Do you think we need to streamline service account permissions with developers permissions? What do you think, Peter, from your experience?
Yeah, for sure. I think I've seen cases where, as you said, the service accounts almost have blank allow all for everything permissions. They're not really fine-grained at all. So I think it's definitely something that we should all be looking into. And I think, yeah, it's something that we can do with things like Open. I can't say much about OpenFJ because I've not looked at it too much. I understand that there's a relationship-based one, but yeah, for sure we should be looking at more fine-grained access on service accounts, because I'm sure that most companies now probably still just have a username, and the user account could just basically do everything that it needs to do, and maybe even some more. So yeah.
Sebastian, do you get any chance to experience an architecture where you create service account on the fly only for a specific operation? Do you get to that part there?
Not, I mean, not in the service account in itself, but like tokens. It was more like the token-based approach. It's like you have a service account, you're not creating an additional account, but you create a token for this account that is only short-lived. Yes, that we see actually. I would still say often, but it's not. Let's put it in a scenario. For example, with machinery, access to machinery. Then you see this pattern a lot implemented because you want to have only short-lived access to data to, for example, control a machine. And yeah, that's a thing. So it's more like use case based. I saw it for specific use cases a lot that only require short-lived access, but not a service account on the fly. It's more like the tokens that have been generated.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is a very classic scenario of OOS scopes. This is why they are made in the beginning, to create accounts that are limited. And I mean, that's interesting, not exactly related to the discussion. It's more like general authorization discussion, but there is, OAuth is stand for open authorization, but mainly do for authentication. But these scopes of OAuth, they are giving you some form of permissions. And the question is, do you really want to trust the scope to get the decision, or do you think you should evolve them with other policy engines and fine-grained authorization system to get the fine-grained decisions on top of the scopes?
I mean, from my point of view, I found it more comfortable not to use scopes to actually do this in the relation. That's why I also look at the relationship-based modeling is like taking the identity as one factor in the relationship or to the actual permission, to actually pull out that I get a token that's lived for like 50 minutes. I cannot invalidate because GWT should be decentralized, should not have a central server, and then you stick with that, but you have to actually revoke it below the 50 minutes. And you could only do this if you're not trusting the scope, but trusting a central system, which is, of course, problematic in a sense because, for example, GWT tokens were invented, from my point of view, a lot because you have decentralized systems that don't want to request a central system again to make it more efficient, to distribute us around like, I'll go for the middleware, I go to the application, I go down to the I don't have a storage server, I push this along without needing to authenticate this. But that's posing the problem of like a global consistency of a system and not trusting scopes for amount of time versus the other one. So yeah, there's benefits in both. I would say it depends a lot on how you model security. A globally consistent system can be beneficial if it's really security relevant, with the trade-off that this requires more resources and it's more complicated to operate. As you said sometime before, yes, for this to work, a global consistent, you have to have something like Spanner, right? Like Google has. So you don't get this very often. There are not many open source alternatives, and one is put actually a lot off the table right now with CockroachDB, which has some similar thing, but they changed their license, which make it really harder to actually use right now because they have, I think, sometimes like years that they will not publish this as a open source license or compatible open source license. So this getting more complicated, but this is a different thing to discuss.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thomas is working for it. So it sounds like you're more in favor of opaque token for this. Thomas, by the way, is a huge fan of opaque tokens. I think Thomas would need to do a live stream about opaque tokens. That actually, yeah, this like token scopes and claims actually is a long discussion. We should extend this discussion in a different time. I'll say that there is another question that came here that I think it's very more for Peter. So I really like to answer this question live because people are asking them live. So hello, I would love to know your thought on pushing OPA data updates using Opal REST APIs. Also, in your experience, how this data push-based approach work out, especially in a distributed system, with high frequency data updates for multiple service auth data updates. Thank you. Actually, I thought, I mean, I will love to hear your thought on that, but I mistakenly read the Opal as OPA, so
Yeah,
I'll
I'll
also
let
take
you handle the Opal part.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you'll start with the OPA and then I'll continue with the
Yeah,
OPA.
so I mean, it works really well for us. We use an S3 bucket to push all our data to and pull our data to. We're not at that point yet where we're like millions and millions of requests per second or anything like that. We're probably maybe in the thousands, and we feel like it scales really well. I mean, you can run as a sidecar, right, and on every node or wherever you want to put it, so it scales pretty well horizontally like that. So yeah, we haven't had any problems with that.
So you actually run OPA as a sidecar for every like backstage instance?
Yeah, well, currently we have one backstage instance, and then we run OPA as a sidecar to it. Yeah.
So I'll take the Opal part.
Yeah.
So the Opal REST API, as Peter mentioned, aim to solve the problem of the distribution. So you can run OPA natively as a sidecar to every container. But you need to make sure that it always synchronizes with the schema and the data. And one of the benefits of Opal, and I'm connecting that to Sebastian statement about correctness and global consistency. When you do Opal without continuously manage the state of the data, then you get hard with synchronizing that. So for example, in Peter's case, you are using the S3, but you lost the way to manage the state. You lost the way to manage the consistency. What Opal help you to do is the REST APIs, and we actually just these days working to even improve that, is to help with high frequency data updates for multiple services. That's actually a problem that Opal, the main problem that Opal trying to solve, to keep everything synchronized, to keep all the sidecars synchronized with the configuration, so you can separate. You can say this sidecar get this portion of data, this sidecar get the other portion of data, and then you also get the ability to run verification on top of OPA and stuff like that, but also make sure that you are working with global consistency only for critical data updates. So one of the things you can do with Opal, you can separate the APIs and say, okay, this kind of data are not critical. I work with eventual consistency and I'm trust the verification and not the correctness. But for this particular data updates, I want to get critical updates, and then you'll wait for the right data to arrive, which can take longer. And that's actually the same with OpenFGA. Another interesting point about Opal that I think is good to mention is that finally we have someone in the community that working on OpenFGA for Opal. So if you ever run OpenFGA, you know it's not always easy to run it across the software development lifecycle. You need to find a way where to store your schema. You need to find a way to synchronize your data. So we have open issue in the community and someone that actually already start working on that to add OpenFGA support to Opal, and then you'll be able to run OpenFGA with all the consistency of the GitOps for the schema, etc. So just stay tuned. I also see another question about, do you have any knowledge about how APNs work? I actually know APNs from Apple push notifications, so I'm not sure how is that related for our, but if you have any kind of information about the APNs, or if Manish, you want to tell us more what you mean by APNs, I'll be happy to know about it. But I think in the meantime, I think, Peter, that's also interesting. I mean, it's actually interesting for you both because you both work on open source project with many contributors and community. There is, of course, from the chat that we have differences between open source project and internal project in terms of permissions management. How do you think, what do you think is the practices to manage permissions in open source project? I think I'll start with you, Sebastian, because I know you do a lot of open source projects. You also start with describing this
Yeah,
baseline.
if you give me some tips, that would be great, Sebastian, because I'm
I
all
don't know. I don't know if I have really good tips. I mean, like for me, it's like, again, if you manage a lot of projects, I think something like doing it declaratively is one thing. But I have to be honest. I think like building in the open makes you less prone to actually thinking a lot about security. Like, do I have to actually protect something? Is it internal? Is it private? Because it's everything open. Then you have only to consider from point of view who you let in to make these contributions. And the only thing I found really helpful is to do it, for example, via Terraform and manage this. Because the problem with, I do a lot of on GitHub. I have to be honest, I'm not living on GitHub, GitLab, because of my history. I'm doing a lot on open source on GitHub. You don't get all of the benefits that you have, for example, with their cloud offers that they have now with enterprise, the enterprise cloud, and even their local ones, which is not open source, of course, but it's the enterprise offers. So there you get a lot of these things, but you cannot use it on the open source space. So yeah, I don't have great tips. I try to do it with Terraform as consistently as I can to manage it, but yeah. But I have to be honest. For me, the beauty to build in the open is actually that you don't have to care about it. We have a lot of secret projects, right? As any company, you have a lot of secret stuff, and you try to protect it as best as you can. On the other end, is like it's open source, and basically, if no one screws up your chain, the things that you bring in, like dependencies and so on and so forth, which is a problem that OPA cannot solve, right? You have vectors for your open source project that are much more problematic actually than the permissions on your repository. Just saying that this is more interesting with security vectors, but yeah, I think it's a beauty to build in the open actually to avoid all of this.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of lucky with the way that my plugin works. Is when you spin up Backstage, you provide like a config file, you can have a local config file which you never commit, and that's where you kind of put in your tokens and stuff like that. So when people work on it, they just they use their own token. They don't commit it, obviously, and they can spin up the plugin in Backstage and import whatever users they want. So they can kind of test it with their own data if they want to. I think that the challenge I actually find is not kind of directly related to authorization in the project, but is building a way to. I like the word frameworkify. I like to frameworkify everything so that when a developer consumes whatever plugin or whatever thing I build or we build, is I want them to do as little as possible, right? You just want to just import like a single method or something like that, and then just use it. But thinking of how to make something flexible enough that we have to think of, okay, how is everybody going to use permissions in this Backstage instance? What kind of information they want? Like, do they want RBAC, ABAC, or whatever? How can you make it flexible? That I find quite challenging, because I always see it through the way I would use it. But then you realize, oh, these guys want to use JWT tokens only, or they want to use the roles only. So I do find that part challenging, trying to think of covering your bases.
Yeah, and
I think
one addition to that, I would do this. You have a lot of, if you bring in open source and you want to have people that use this, they often come with an infrastructure that's predefined, for example, by their enterprise policies or whatever. For example, you have API gateways, and then you come with the challenge that they actually have a system where you have to plug in, which is not that easy from point of view. For example, if one wants to use Tyke, for example, for API management, there's not actually an easy way on an open API specification to implement OpenFGA. They support Go plugins. They support Go plugins via gRPC, but what they don't provide is a good way to actually track down. That's really detailed to track down the operation that you are doing with one request. So you cannot actually infer the one operation, and then you cannot infer what is the actually fine-grained authorization for that. But this is what the people bring, and then they are asking a question like, "Oh, we have this authorization layer on our own, and now we want to integrate." And then you have to say, "Whoa, yeah, no, thanks, this is an open source project. We don't think about it. We don't have the leverage to support all of the API gateways and all of the configurations that you have. So yeah, that's a tough challenge actually.
I think if I'm taking your both answers and try to summarize that, I think you said in open source you need to make sure you do separation of duty, not only in the code but in the roles of what the code can do. So you need, for example, to make sure that you are stopping the CI. Your open source project, even if it's, for example, deployed to Docker, this is where you put the borderline. No one has access to the deployment phase.
Yeah.
You do everything you want in contribution, you do everything you want in integration, but when you get to delivery, then you stop. And you also make sure that you, for example, keep that things private, right? You keep them things in a way that people cannot. And I think if I'm looking at the code, also here, the separation of duties, make sure that everything related to this configuration, everything declarative that related to this configuration, is supposed to keep private and let the other user the responsibility to make sure that they are giving the right permissions for their developers and for their users. And I think that that's a good that's a good statement to put. Just make sure you do a separation of duties when you do an open source project, so you draw the borderline. Until here, I get community contribution. Until here, I get everyone who want to contribute, but from this line, that's responsible only. And then you can just have the same internal baseline of permissions that actually want to work with that. I think another question that came to my mind is the question of developer experience and developer productivity, because I know that one of the main barriers for developers is when they do not have access somewhere. You know, you're working in a local machine and then you need really fast access to some environment. How do you deal with that? Do you have any practices?
So I'm a great favor of, I have to plug in the product GitHub code spaces, which is really great to actually have a consistent environment, run in the cloud that you have always access to, and that you can size to your projects, because sometimes you need on the machine because you're testing something that is Kubernetes heavy and you want to test something that has a lot of pods, whatever, and you need a beefy machine for doing that, and also switching contexts a lot. It's a great thing. If I have to do it locally, I also do this a lot with containers. And my go-to solution right now, my favorite is OrbStack. Actually, I have to admit, I use this a lot because I think it's a great product. So, but I should try to do every development that I do in all of the open source projects that I do. They have a dev container configuration, so they are compatible, hopefully, with code spaces and Visual Studio Code. If you have a Docker or whatever on your local machine that you can run this on, you should have an environment that is pre-configured, consistent across the environment.
So you said that, if I understand correctly, you said that developer permissions should work on both sides, on the way that they are delivered to production, but also on the way that they are delivered to the local environment, to the local machine. There is another aspect of developer experience that I really like to get your answer about it, Peter. I know I wrote some lines of Rigo in my life, and we in Permit wrote a lot of Rigo. What do you think about this learning curve of developers to learn like a new language that is not always intuitive?
I'm so glad you asked me this question, because Anders, as you mentioned earlier, is a good friend of mine as well, and Charlie, they built Regal. Have you heard of Regal yet?
Yeah.
It's the linter for Rego. And I think I will admit, I think when I first started looking at OPA, which is a couple of years ago now, actually, it was a bit difficult for me to kind of hit the floor running kind of thing. But I think when you make that, it can be an investment, or now it's a much less investment with Regal, because Regal simplifies it a lot. But when you finally understand Rego and you get to that point where you go, okay, I know what I'm doing now, the payoff is so great that I think it's worth putting that effort in. But if you find that you're struggling with Rego, I definitely say try Regal, because it will help you write your policies better. But it is an investment. I do agree. Yeah, it was tricky for me.
the approach of using linting is actually a nice approach. I never heard about it explicitly, but
It's
I
very
remember
smart.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that when I started to so I do full stack, I do backend, I do front end, and when I started to work with React, I was always asking myself, how should I model my code? Where should I put the? I don't know the design pattern. I don't know nothing, and the solution for me was there is a I don't know if it's still popular. For long years I didn't implement React in production, but I don't know if it's still popular, but there was a set of Airbnb rules for React. That was a set
Yes.
for ESLint rules for React. And that was super helpful for me because that gives me the answer. This is where you should put your code.
Yeah.
This is the recommended structure. This is the way that you separate data from schema. From it's actually kind of, in React is the same. You want to put the schema in the rendering code, but you don't want to do data manipulation and data work there. So it helps you tell you shouldn't change this variable here. So that's actually a great advice. I'm going to use that because people are
Yeah.
asking.
I've even since then I've started to use a Hado lint as well, which is another one for Docker, for Docker files, and a Markdown linter as well. But I can't remember who to credit for those, but they're definitely great. Yeah, it's just, hey, don't do
Yeah.
this. You should be doing this. It's just such a much way. You don't think about it anymore. You just read what it says, and you can even sometimes press the quick fix button in VS Code, and it will just do it for you. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So that was, the time was really fast. So we are now 5 minutes to the end of the hour. So I'll remind the audience, if you have any questions or any more topics that you want us to talk about, that's a great time to ask. Thanks, Shaked, for putting the Q&A here. That's really smart. So again, any questions, just send them wherever you are watching us, and we'll try to answer them. I think, again, I really wait for this learning curve question for the end of the hour, because that's something I think that in every talk I gave about open policy agent, at the end someone asked that. We started to evaluate that, and we found this is super non-intuitive language. How do you convince your people to do that? So I think
when I started building my plugin, I went around to there's a few conferences I went to, and I spoke to a few people and told them what I'm doing, and they would always say, "Oh, how do you get around the Rego? The Rego's so difficult," and all this kind of stuff. But I think people are scared of it, more scared of it than they should be. I think it is not as hard, I don't think, as people think it is.
Yeah. Oh, so we see that people just giving us the flattering of a great session. Thank you all. I think, Sebastian, because since we do not have a question, I think a question that I want to ask you is about Google Zanzibar. One of the things that people talk about Google Zanzibar is about this consistency as price, and the price is the time it takes for a response to get. Either is because the data is large, or either is because the data we need to wait. Do you have any practices? Soon we'll have Opal support with OpenFGA, but for people who just want to use OpenFGA, do you have any advice on how to deal with that trade-off?
Accept it. I think it depends on, again, I think we discussed this before. It can be there's always a trade-off, and I think the trade-off comes with the facing the problem. For example, if you have different environments, let's say you really want to have the same authorization system across two clouds. Let's say AWS and an AWS environment and the Azure environment, and then put a GCP in there. You want to have this because you're needing it. Then you have to put in the trade-off, because otherwise you introduce a lot of complexity. But the headache that you will get is, for that you need basically a database that is capable of doing this and doing it consistently. So I would not say how you can deal with that. You cannot avoid it, but if that's a requirement that you have to accept it. That's the only thing. You have to put in you have to do the discussion with your stakeholders and say, guys, look, if this write is not successful across all of your environments, yes, then you have to retry. And then it may take a couple of seconds, whatever, however the latency is between data centers or whatever you want to do there. I think that's a lot of the things like with the aspirations that you have and the SLAs and SLOs you have with your stakeholders. That's the key. You have to manage this. Yes. That's my take for that.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I actually, that for me, it was enough with the accept it. That's what we need. So with that, we are ending our hour. Thank you very much for Sebastian and Peter for joining us today. That was a super helpful discussion and a lot of great insights. And I'm really happy to. Do you have any last words you want to say?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very
inviting me.
much. Yeah, it's been fun.